For the News and Observer, I'm Brian Murphy, your host for this special episode of Under the Dome. This is the next to last episode of our special Closer Look series on the new podcast from Serial and the New York Times about the Bladen County Improvement Association. It's called the Improvement Association. Yes, it's a podcast about a podcast. But the 2018 fraud in the 9th Congressional District election is a story we covered closely, so hopefully we have some insight to add. Thanks for following along. This is episode 4. Episode 4 of the Serial podcast focuses on what happened with the Bladen County Improvement Association, a group of Black Democrats who have been around for about a decade after the 2018 election. The group didn't go away. But Democrat Dan McCready, who ran for the 9th District seat in 2018 and again in the 2019 special election, didn't seek out the association's help in a special election, and it led to all sorts of hard feelings inside the group, which seems to be falling apart in many ways in this episode. Add to that the unsuccessful campaign to elect 3 Black women to the Elizabethtown City Council in 2020, and it's not hard to see the group's power is slipping, in part because critics have portrayed it as corrupt, and in part because of internal dynamics. I'm joined today by Tyler Dukes and Will Doran, both of the News and Observer, who covered parts of the 2018 case at the time. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
This episode feels like it breaks some new ground. You know, after 2018, many outlets covered the 2019 special election. Others focused on what happened with McCrae Dallas, you know, the white GOP operative at the heart of the election fraud case. But this sort of embedded look at what happened in the Improvement Association was new to me. Tyler, what stood out to you?
Yeah, I think, those of us who covered 2018 and the aftermath, we certainly saw the involvement of the Bladen County Improvement Association and the PAC. And we reached out to those folks quite often, actually, when we were, covering what was happening on the ground. And we would talk to them from time to time, but we never really got this sort of inside look that Zoe Chase, the reporter at the core of the Serial podcast, is getting here, this inside look inside the organization. And this idea that she is exploring, particularly in this episode, that Black voters in Bladen County specifically are not a monolith. And this is a thing that the Improvement PAC is actually sort of struggling with. I thought that was a really interesting look at what is happening in Bladen County and how, as you said, that power, at least from this podcast, appears to be slipping.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and one that I came away with. We tend to think of Black voters or evangelical voters or rural voters or you name the category as sort of this monolith. And this episode, I think, does a great job of pointing out that no, they're all individuals with their own point of view about what's happening. Will, how about you? What stood out to you in this episode?
There was one, it was really just kind of an aside, but where she talks about, she's got some recording of her meeting with some of the Improvement Association members, and one of them makes a joke about how he's going to get lynched because he's seen out in public with a white woman. And obviously that is, a longstanding trope for correct reasons. I mean, that is why a lot of, Black men were lynched throughout history. But also in Bladen County, there was a story, a teenage boy named Lennon Lacey, who just a couple of years before this was found hanging in a trailer park. And a lot of people think he was lynched, but the authorities chalked it up to a suicide. And that had been, it was kind of thing. He was dating a white woman and, then was found dead. And it really broke down along racial lines. And that was very fresh. I mean, that happened only a few years before, this was being recorded. And, just the fact that, you just have to joke about it because that's, the only way that you can process that harsh reality is just, that really stuck out to me.
We haven't talked a lot about Zoe on this on this podcast. If you go back one episode, I talked to Colin Campbell about his interview with Zoe. But, she makes a mention that she's often the only white person in these settings that she goes to do reporting on the Bladen County Improvement Association. And I think in some ways, maybe we haven't given her enough credit for what she's been able to get out. That is an awful hard thing to do, to earn the trust of people in a county like this when you're not necessarily from there. And it's clear from the podcast that Horace Munn and Cogdale and some of these Minnie Price in this episode really trust Zoe as a reporter. Tyler, you went down there. How difficult was it to kind of get inside the story of what was happening in Bladen County as an outsider?
Yeah, it is difficult, and it's clear that Zoe Chase has put in the work. I mean, we went out there with a few of our reporters. I was at WRAL at the time, the TV station here in Raleigh, and we knocked on at least 100 doors across Bladen County, just trying to talk to voters who sort of requested absentee ballots and had not gotten them. And that trust is really hard to earn because, look, I'm a North Carolina native, right? I've lived here all my life. But regardless of living in another place in North Carolina, coming into a county like Bladen County, you are still an outsider. And especially at that time, a lot of these folks were getting inundated by people coming in, reporters who looked just like me, right? A white guy from another town coming in and asking questions about what happened. And so it definitely did take time to, earn people's trust. And, some people just aren't going to trust you. And I think that's what we saw even when we tried to contact the Bladen County Improvement Association. Often we were just reaching out to them for specific stories. Zoe Chase has been on the ground for years. I mean, she's been doing the work. And so, I think that takes time and energy and I think she has done it well here. And I think that's why we are getting this depth of storytelling.
Tyler, I think that's a really good point about, even someone coming in from Raleigh to talk to people might seem as foreign as someone coming in from, New York City or Washington, D.C. to talk to people. You hear the PAC Association, telling each other, telling Zoe in this episode, we're getting noticed up in Raleigh. And, that's why Dan McCready isn't courting us and, is kind of not asking us for support, not really wanting to associate himself with us. The folks in Raleigh are noticing us. Bladen County is the kind of place that's, very small, rural, fairly impoverished place. And they're kind of used to flying under the radar and, doing their own thing. And, someone from, the big city here in Raleigh is, just as foreign as somebody from, up north coming in and asking questions.
I would say it's not just, the Bladen County, it's not just the racial divide. I talked to Ray Britt and tried to get in with those people, with the white Republicans who, McCrae Dallas's folks, and they were it's equally as hard. I think for the reason that you just pointed out, Will, we're from Raleigh. We're from the big city. We're not from Bladen County. And so there's, Zoe has to deal with not only the racial component, but there's also this outsider component that plays into it, whether you're trying to get into the association or you're trying to get into sort of McCrae Dallas's operation at the time. A lot was made about McCready not reaching out to the association and even somewhat actively distancing himself from the group. It doesn't appear, if you look at the numbers, that was necessarily a fatal mistake, that's what cost him the election. I've been going over this a lot with the Cal Cunningham race in 2020 about whether the affair and those allegations were a fatal mistake. It's really hard to separate out why people lost an election. But if you look at the numbers, Dan Bishop, who's now the representative from the 9th District, won by about a little less than 4,000 votes in the runoff. Mark Harris won, I'll put that in quotes, because he never got certified by less than 900. So you're talking about somewhere around a 3,000 vote change. Bladen County just not populated enough to be the difference in that. Tyler, I know you're a data guy and you've run some numbers on this about these numbers and what happened in neighboring Robeson County, which was also impacted by what McCrae Dallas was doing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we did at the time when we were trying to do the postmortem after 2018, and this was as the election board was gearing up for this hearing. So we know a lot more now than we did then. But I mean, we went through every single one of these absentee ballot envelopes, right? These are the forms that are basically you fill out and you get your witness to fill out, and you seal the ballot inside of it. The envelopes themselves are public record. We went through every single one of those for Robeson County and Bladen County. And logged who signed on the witness form. And we were able to determine that at least 15% of those ballots from both Robeson and Bladen County, where the Dallas operation was ongoing, were touched by people who, witnessed by people who were working with McCrae Dallas. And we had reported that at the time. But I mean, it just kind of goes to show how widespread this operation is, right? That you can do this get out the vote thing, even if you do it right, if you're not harvesting ballots, right? You're just going out and witnessing people, ballots, which was legal at the time. It was a large operation, proportional to a county. And these are large counties, right? Rural counties where you have to do a lot of driving. And so that really stood out to me at the time when we were trying to, get our hands around this.
Will, when you look at the numbers, and in 2020, because of redistricting, Bladen County is no longer in the 9th Congressional District. It's actually in David Rouser's district in the 7th, so it was hard to get a comparison to 2020. But when you look at the numbers and you listen to the podcast, it seems like McCready's distancing himself from the organization did more damage to the organization maybe than it did to Dan McCready.
Yeah, I think they were, certainly looking for him to stick up for them more than he did. I think that's pretty clear. Obviously, McCready didn't do himself any favors by not really actively courting this group and trying to really, juice up the vote in Bladen County. But I think you also have to give Dan Bishop a lot of credit. I mean, he campaigned really hard in Robeson County, especially with the Lumbee tribe. Talked a lot about getting them federal recognition, which is something, politicians have been promising and failing to do for decades. And so far that has also still failed, even though he is now in Congress. And you even had, President Trump also campaigning on that same thing with the Lumbees successfully. I mean, he did great in Robeson County in 2020, historically Democratic county that just went super red last year. So obviously this episode kind of focuses on the ways that, maybe Dan McCready shot himself in the foot. But, I think, give Dan Bishop some credit as well. He campaigned really hard. And like you said, he won by an even larger margin than Mark Harris did, and did so without the benefit of an operation like McRae-Dallas's.
If you want, I mean, this number is staggering to me. McCready won Robeson County 56-41 in 2018. And in 2019, McCready still won Robeson County, but he won it 50-49. And then if you go to 2020, it has flipped, and it went for Trump in a big way. And so you're talking about a 15-point win that McCready had in a county, and within 2 years that has flipped completely. Pretty remarkable. We've talked a lot about Bladen County, certainly on this podcast, and we've talked a lot about Robeson County for a lot of reasons, but the political flipping fortunes in Robeson County, I think, is fascinating and maybe worth its own sort of deeper look, closer look. Tyler, you grew up. You mentioned earlier that you grew up in North Carolina, and you grew up in Elizabeth City, which is certainly in the news right now. And this isn't necessarily the podcast to talk about that, but it's another Eastern North Carolina county. Another Eastern North Carolina county that has a racial divide in some ways. When they were talking about what happened in 2020, in the 2020 election there in Elizabethtown, obviously different than Elizabeth City, and they were describing, driving through the town, and these four families own all the land, sort of on the white side of town, and the black side of town can't get any commercial development. I just thought it was a fascinating look at some of those counties, as we call them, east of I-95 in North Carolina, and kind of the way they operate, the way that historic things that have happened in history are now playing out in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah. I mean, this is the reality of life in a lot of rural places, right? When you've got a town that's, less than 20,000 people. I mean, I like I said, grew up in Elizabeth City, which, fluctuated between, around a population of 17 to 18,000 people. And if you look at the downtown corridors, I mean, a lot of the streets are named after the families that own the property there, right? So, and a lot of those names persist within the town. I mean, they're really, the land ownership is a big deal in a lot of places. And the policies that led to the way that these towns are segregated, which is not unique, I should say, to rural towns. This is something we see in many major cities across the country. This segregation, sort of the white side of town and the black side of town in most places, this isn't accidental. This isn't often even people just choosing where they live, right? This is often by design. It's by policy. And you can see that when you go back and look at the history of these places, especially in places like the South, but even in other major cities across the country.
Yeah, my first job was in Macon, Georgia, and I was struck by how divided the town was. That's educational opportunities, living opportunities, you name it. The town was very divided along racial lines. Will, we've gone this far without talking about who I think is the star of this episode, and that's Minnie Price, the treasurer of the Bladen County Improvement Association, and the one person, at least so far, who's been willing to stand up to Horace Munn. I mean, kind of rules this pack with an iron fist in many ways. And Minnie Price, who is described as someone in her 70s, and a person with some definite influence among the Black community in Bladen County, sort of has stood up to him in many ways in this episode.
Yeah, it was interesting, the kind of intra-group battle between, do we stick up for ourselves, and do we, kind of make a statement by staying out of the race and, sticking it to the McCready campaign, or do we kind of put our egos aside for that and, just elect the Democrat, even if he's not the biggest fan of ours, even if he maybe actively is trying to avoid us, elect him anyways, because, at least we like his politics better. That obviously is a huge, part of this episode, and I think something that plays out in tons of group dynamics, whether it's corporations or political groups. I mean, anyone can identify with that. I think there's also the unavoidable dynamic here of, the one woman who's in kind of a leadership position, kind of pushing back against the group of 3 or 4 men who are in slightly higher leadership positions and who she feels are just kind of, make it maybe a little bit of a boys club atmosphere. I'm a legislative reporter. We're actually seeing that in the news right now. We've got, some stories down at the legislature about the Speaker of the House kind of ramming through a bill that will personally financially benefit him and some other members of the House. And there's one woman representative who said that I think this is, not something we should be doing. She was the chair or a chair of the finance committee and then lost her seat on that as the chair of that committee because she spoke out against it and said, this is something we need to take a look at. And it was the same kind of thing. She kind of pointed to a boys club atmosphere and all that. So, I think that this is definitely not something that is, confined only to Bladen County, only one group. I mean, this is, a dynamic that repeats itself.
I think there's a bit of a through line here too to the more national politics, and at the risk of sort of flattening the complexity of the Bladen County Improvement Association PAC, because I think there's a lot more going on here than just the grappling with how seriously the Democratic Party is taking the concerns of Black voters. But we're certainly seeing Black voters as a bloc, sort of exercise their power in very stark ways. I mean, we saw that in Georgia and other places in recent elections. And, we have certainly heard groups challenge the Democratic Party on whether or not they're listening enough to those Black voters and doing enough to not just court their votes, but to enact policies that those voting blocs actively want. So I think in some ways, this is a reflection, even in the small county, this rural county, of what the conversation we're seeing nationally here.
Yeah, this has the added dynamic of people like trying to protect their own power too. But I think we saw this, with Jim Clyburn, right? His endorsement of Joe Biden seemed to turbo boost Biden's presidential ambitions. And now, because of that, he holds a lot of sway on personnel and policy. But we're seeing it in all different kinds of ways. Will, you were talking about the gender dynamics. I just wrote a story about Erica Smith and a member of the Democratic Party, not a Republican, a member of the Democratic Party, sort of feeling enabled, I guess, a male member of the Democratic Party, feeling enabled to critique her email that she sent out about slavery and the plight of Black Americans in this country. We saw it in the state legislature. We saw it, and we saw maybe the other side of this yesterday in the U.S. House when Mark Robeson, North Carolina's first Black lieutenant governor, spoke on a voting rights panel and said, hey, Blacks in America have overcome many, many things. Don't tell me that we're not able to get a free voter ID to vote. And so I think, and Tim Scott, the only Black Republican in the U.S. Senate, is giving the rebuttal to Joe Biden. I think there's a lot of, to Tyler's point, there is a lot happening in this space right now about, I think Republicans in some ways are starting to really compete for Black voters in a way that maybe they didn't before the Trump era. and Trump was able to make some inroads in that community. And we'll see as Trump sort of exits the picture if Republicans are able to capitalize on some of those gains in the Black community, largely made on the play that, as Tyler said, Democrats are taking our vote for granted in many ways, and that's obviously a central issue in this episode of the Serial podcast.
Yeah, I mean, not to keep bringing it back to Robeson County, but I think that's something that that Republicans did well there is, say, hey, y'all have been a Democratic county forever, but Democrats are kind of taking you for granted. So why don't you give us a try? The turnaround in that county from, being plus 15 Democrat or whatever to now being narrowly pro-Republican is in 2 years is just stunning. So yeah, I think that's going to be definitely a huge factor in the 2022 Senate race here, the 2024 presidential and governor's race. In 2020, you did see Black voters, as well as every other racial group of voters, white voters, Asian voters, Hispanic voters, all had record voter turnout here in North Carolina. And I think in large part that was because we had, I should note, only temporary rules in 2020 for mail-in voting that made it easier to request a ballot, easier to vote a ballot, easier to send your ballot back in, and, maybe overcome like some problems, like you didn't sign it directly on the right line that you're supposed to sign or something like that. We had all these rules to kind of just make voting by mail easier along every step of the way. And that led to every single group having record voter turnout, more voters than ever, not just in terms of numbers, but percentages. All of those rules are going away, though, for 2022, 2024. So I think, especially on the Democratic side, you're going to have a lot of people scrambling to figure out, okay, how do we replicate that? And how do we make sure that we have that kind of turnout again? And for Democrats, that means being able to reach out to Black voters and convince them, to keep voting on the Democratic Party side, which, historically 80 to 90% of Black voters vote Democratic.
And Representative Deborah Ross, who represents Wake County, she's a Democrat, pointed to Mark Robinson and said, look, just because we have expanded voting, more people participating in the vote doesn't mean Democrats are going to win, which seems to be the sort of national perspective. She's like, look at how well Republicans did in North Carolina in 2020 when there was expanded voting. We need to wrap it up. I want to go to Tyler for the last one. The episode, the preview of the final episode seems to hint at maybe a division coming in the Bladen County Improvement Association. I'm interested to hear what happens with Minnie Price. Your sense of what's happening, and as we look forward, what is one or two things you're looking forward to in this podcast and as we approach some of these issues sort of statewide?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in where the Bladen County Improvement PAC is going to land after this rift and what their future looks like. I mean, because I think what we saw Zoe Chase outline here is the construction of Black political machinery in Bladen County. And, we take for granted, the political machines that have been built over the years in other places in North Carolina and, nationally and in the state. But, looking at, how this group is going to function going forward and the challenges that it faces, I think I'm interested to see what their takeaway is going to be looking forward, as opposed to relitigating some of these old elections and sort of where the group is going next.
Thank you, Tyler Dukes, and thank you, Will Doran, for joining us. That'll wrap up our special episode of Under the Dome about the Serial podcast on the Bladen County Improvement Association. We'll have one more new episode of Under the Dome for the final episode of the Serial podcast. Plus, we have our Monday Look Ahead podcast on this same feed. For the News and Observer, I'm Brian Murphy saying see you next time on Under the Dome.
For more from our politics team, subscribe to the News and Observer at newsobserver.com/subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at Under the Dome and NC Insider, and sign up for our weekly political newsletter at newsobserver.com/newsletters. Thanks for listening.